My next guest ended up being a confidant of corrupt former Queensland Police Commissioner Terry Lewis until the publication of one of his books which detailed the State Police Service's shady dealings. Now, upon the death of Terry Lewis, aged 95, journalist and author Matthew Condon is reflecting on the controversial figure's life and lies. Joining me now is Matthew Condon, senior reporter with The Australian. Thanks very much for your time. I guess just to start with, because the passage of time and descriptions of Terry Lewis perhaps softened over the years, but this was, corruption at the heart and soul of the Queensland Police Force.
Without doubt, Tom. I mean, yes, of course, an elderly man has died, a father, a grandfather, but we cannot forget the critical role Terry played in quite literally one of the darkest chapters in Queensland history. We may never see the likes of it again. So it's important, I think, for historically and contemporaneously to never forget what happened.
Your book detailed his whole career, and yes, he ended up at the apex, of course, as commissioner, but essentially being a big part of what at that time was a force where it's important to say not everyone was corrupt, but if you wanted to progress, essentially you needed to be.
That's very true. And it was a system that evolved over about 3 decades. So you're looking at a group of ambitious young officers, Lewis, Tony Murphy and Glenn Hallahan in the 1950s, where they began moments of small-time criminality, bribery, extorting money from sex workers, etc. And over the decades, and most certainly with the arrival in the commissionership of Frank Bischoff from 1958 to 1969, Bischoff was really the master's apprentice in terms of corruption in that era. He took those 3 men, known colloquially as the Rat Pack, under his wing, and essentially they polished to a fine art that extortion and those early forays into corruption in the 50s. And it quite literally got out of control by the 70s and the 80s when Lewis was commissioner, until, as these things do, it ultimately collapsed under its own weight.
We had the Fitzgerald inquiry, a lot of allegations or findings, I should say, of corruption within that. Terry Lewis always maintained it was essentially a witch hunt, he'd done nothing wrong. And that was something he maintained on the record throughout many, many hours of interviews with you. But you detailed today, which you'd done before, 6 words he actually said to your wife upon first meeting. He'd arrived promptly in a well-ironed, short-checked shirt, unfailingly polite, but while you were cooking steaks, he let something drop in the kitchen.
Yes, he did indeed, and it's a moment I'll never forget. That was in 2010, and he said to my wife, Kate, essentially, we were all on the take. He never made any further admissions to me or anybody else since he passed away last Friday. So I have sat on that story now for it's almost 13 years, and felt it was time to tell it. It was an astonishing moment. It was an admission that he never made to me after 3 long years of interrogation and interview with him, and never made it in public. So, I decided today that it was the right time to tell that story.
Yeah, those 6 little words which you alluded to, a fascinating insight. Also, I mean, obviously you had the Commission of Inquiry and all the colour that provided, but fascinating to hear just the different people anecdotally that in some way were in touch with either Terry Lewis or I was fascinated by the line of one shopkeeper who said that when his wife actually came to the store, she always noted the sort of mildew or mouldy smell on these crisp notes that were pulled out of her wallet. In her words, she thought the money had been buried. That's the smell the money had on it.
Yes, I mean, when I published those books starting in 2013, quite literally hundreds and hundreds of people have come forward to me. They still come forward to me with anecdotes, stories, sightings, recollections, which all come together in a mosaic of a pretty sad story, in essence. Yes, so they keep rolling in, those stories. I'm sure there are many more out there. Having said that, with the death of Lewis, we're very, very close to the end of an era. I think, though, Tom, you made a very good point earlier. There was a handful of corrupt individuals and so many thousands of good, honest, hardworking men and women in the police service who had to live under the shadow, under the yoke of this terrible weight, and it's been a burden for decades.
Matthew Condon, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.